Yesterday, literally yesterday, Canada signed a deal with China that could completely lock American wheat buyers out of North American grain markets for the next decade. I'm not exaggerating. While most of the world slept, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney was in Beijing, shaking hands with Xi Jinping and quietly restructuring the food supply chain that has fed the United States for 70 years. Here's what really happened. Canada agreed to slash tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, and in return, China reduced its crushing 85% tariffs on Canadian canola down to just 15%. On the surface, it looks like a simple trade deal, a small economic swap, but it's far more than that. Buried in this agreement is a quiet but seismic shift. Canada is now China's main agricultural partner in North America. And American food processors, many of them in small towns across Montana, North Dakota, and Minnesota, are about to feel pressures they've never even imagined. This didn't happen overnight. It's the culmination of decisions made over the past year, all colliding in real time. 6 months ago, President Trump slapped 25% tariffs on Canadian agricultural products, supposedly to pressure Canada over trade deficits and border security. But the actual result? He pushed one of America's closest allies straight into China's arms, literally. Carney spent yesterday finalizing deals that will reshape global agriculture for decades to come. Canada, after all, is the third largest wheat exporter in the world, controlling 15% of global trade. For 40 years, American grain processors have blended Canadian wheat with domestic crops as a standard practice. It's not optional. The supply chains were built around this integration. You can't simply replace Canadian spring wheat with Australian or Argentinian grain overnight. The infrastructure doesn't exist. But that's only the beginning. The real story lies in how Trump's tariffs triggered chaos inside Canada's agricultural sector. Canadian farmers were hit by a double whammy: American tariffs blocking their southern market, and Chinese tariffs of 85% cutting off their Asian buyers. These weren't symbolic numbers, they were designed to crush trade, and they worked. Between March and August of 2025, Canadian canola exports to China fell by 70%, pork shipments dropped by 19%, and lobster and crab exports nearly disappeared. Farmers watched warehouses fill with unsellable products while their businesses teetered on collapse. And what did Carney do? What any rational leader would do in the face of an economic catastrophe. He found a new partner. That partner is China. This deal isn't just about canola and electric vehicles. It's the start of a strategic partnership covering energy, agriculture, and trade. Carney openly stated that China has become a more predictable partner than the United States. Think about that for a moment. The Prime Minister of Canada, a democratic nation, publicly declaring that Communist China is more reliable than America. And this is just the start. Canadian farmers are making planting decisions this very month for the upcoming season. If China offers higher prices in multi-year contracts for canola and wheat, while American buyers remain tangled in tariff uncertainty, guess where those farmers will direct their production? Toward the guaranteed market, not uncertainty. Once Chinese processors become dependent on Canadian supply, logistics shift to Pacific routes, and state-owned enterprises invest in Canadian infrastructure. Reversing this becomes nearly impossible. This isn't a temporary trade dispute, it's a fundamental reordering of North American agriculture that could take decades to undo. Now, the impact on American consumers is already starting to show, even if most people haven't noticed yet. Food prices are climbing fast. After the initial tariffs, wheat prices jumped 12% in just a few weeks. For an average American family of 4 spending around $8,000 a year on groceries, that's nearly $960 extra annually, and that's only for wheat-based products like bread, pasta, cereal, and baked goods. But the price spike is only the surface. The deeper issue is the systematic unraveling of supply chains that have been built over 70 years. Take, for example, a grain processing operation in Kansas. I can't name them because they fear regulatory pushback, but this family-owned business has been buying Canadian spring wheat for 3 generations. They employ 140 people in a small town where alternative jobs are scarce. After the tariffs hit, their raw material costs increased by 28%. they have two options: absorb those losses and risk bankruptcy, or shut down entirely, laying off everyone. And this isn't an isolated case. Across the Midwest, every link in the agricultural chain from processing plants to trucking companies is feeling the squeeze. American farmers are being crushed from both sides. Wheat growers in Montana and North Dakota rely on Canadian wheat to meet export requirements. Those relationships are now disrupted, forcing them to scramble for alternatives at premium prices that erode their margins. Meanwhile, Canadian farmers are pivoting to Asia, chasing stable prices and multi-year contracts with zero tariff uncertainty. Transportation networks are also collapsing. Cross-border trucking companies are seeing volumes drop 40 to 60%. These are usually small, family-run operations with 5 to 10 trucks. When volumes shrink, they can't pivot to other freight, and bankruptcy wipes out decades of specialized expertise. Railways and ports in Seattle and Portland that depend on Canadian grain flows now face reduced shipments, leaving elevators underused and processing plants running below optimal levels. Every link in this chain, logistics, storage, transportation, is under stress simultaneously, and it's only going to get worse. But the deeper, strategic story is even more alarming. The giant agricultural trading companies, the ones controlling global food flows, are quietly repositioning their operations. They are reducing reliance on North American trade because regulatory certainty now matters more than marginal cost savings. When these corporations shift procurement to South America or Australia, the investment follows. Processing facilities, storage infrastructure, and logistics capacity all start moving away from the US-Canada corridor. And this isn't theoretical. Agricultural exports to the U.S. from Canada are already down 6% through September, translating to $1.3 billion in lost trade. Yet the long-term damage isn't even reflected in the numbers yet because it's happening in planting decisions and multi-year contracts being finalized right now. Canadian agricultural exports to China were worth roughly $13 billion annually before the tariff battles. Under Carney's new strategy, Canada aims to double non-U.S. exports from $125 billion to $250 billion, with agriculture forming a massive part of that target. He is explicitly reducing dependence on the unpredictable U.S. market while locking in long-term agreements with China and other Asian buyers. Here's a simple analogy to understand this. Imagine you've been buying bread from the same bakery for 30 years. One day, you start demanding steep discounts, threatening to leave, and publicly questioning their service. The baker eventually finds a new customer willing to pay premium prices and sign long-term contracts. When you finally decide you need that bread again, the baker has already moved on. That's exactly what's happening in North American agriculture. Canada has found a new, reliable buyer in China, and American agriculture is being pushed to the sidelines. You can't rebuild these intricate supply chains overnight. Canadian wheat moves through American ports for export, and U.S. grain blends with Canadian varieties to meet buyer specifications. A 25% tariff inserted into that system is enough to freeze everything, creating cascading disruptions across the continent. Now let's talk about who's actually winning and who's losing in this unfolding trade realignment. Spoiler, it's not America. China is emerging as the clear strategic victor, and it's not even close. While the United States has tried to pressure Canada with tariffs, Beijing quietly secured what it could never achieve through direct confrontation: long-term access to a stable, high-quality food supply. For the Chinese government, food security is a top priority, and these Canadian deals lock in wheat and canola supplies for years to come. But it's not just about buying raw crops. Through this partnership, China is reshaping the geopolitical and economic landscape of North American agriculture, while the U.S. voluntarily relinquishes one of its greatest strategic advantages. Consider the numbers. China has been Canada's largest wheat importer over the past 5 years, taking about 10% of Canadian exports. That share is set to rise sharply under the New Deal. Canola exports alone, previously crippled by 85% tariffs, now face only 15% tariffs, and Chinese buyers are signing multi-year contracts. But the deal isn't limited to agriculture. Canada committed to allowing 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles into the country annually at a 6.1% tariff, increasing to 70,000 vehicles within 5 years. In return, China is investing in Canadian infrastructure, energy projects, and agricultural capacity. This is where the strategic impact becomes permanent. Chinese state-owned enterprises are positioning to invest directly in Canadian storage facilities, processing plants, and transportation networks. Once that capital is embedded, these supply chains become extremely difficult to reverse. Carney was clear, this is a new era in Canada. China relations grounded in realism, respect, and mutually beneficial engagement. Translation: America is unreliable, so Canada is building alternatives that cannot easily be undone. And here's the part that should alarm American strategists the most. When asked whether China is now a more predictable partner than the U.S., Carney didn't hedge. He said it outright. In recent months, China has shown results and consistency that the U.S. has not. On the record, the Prime Minister of Canada just declared China more reliable than America. The international implications of this are staggering. The European Union is watching closely, positioning itself as a stable supplier to both U.S. and Canadian markets. Australian wheat exporters are aggressively courting American buyers, emphasizing reliability and freedom from tariff uncertainty. Argentina is expanding grain production to capitalize on disrupted North American supply chains. Across the globe, competitors are watching America stumble and preparing to take advantage. Meanwhile, the legal framework complicates everything further. The USMCA, the agreement that replaced NAFTA, requires a formal review this year. What was supposed to be routine is now shaping up as a high-stakes negotiation with agricultural access at the center. Canada has made it clear, guaranteed market access and an end to arbitrary tariffs will be conditions for extending the agreement. If these terms aren't met, Canada can pursue annual reviews, creating constant uncertainty that will push investment and trade away from North America. This is where U.S. negotiating leverage has completely shifted. Tariffs intended to pressure Canada instead gave them the justification to pivot toward new markets. And now, when the U.S. needs to renegotiate USMCA, Canada holds all the cards. In the short term, watch whether the Trump administration offers meaningful tariff relief. If they don't, Canadian farmers will lock in long-term contracts with Chinese buyers. Once that happens, planting decisions will favor Asia over the U.S., making the damage permanent. Over the next several months, the actual restructuring of supply chains will unfold. Specialized processing facilities may close, trucking and rail networks reallocate toward Pacific shipping, and Canadian farmland will increasingly focus on crops demanded by Asian markets. Even the types of wheat grown could shift, prioritizing Chinese preferences over American ones, making future reintegration even harder. The long-term consequences of this deal are even more alarming, and most Americans aren't paying attention. For decades, North America has enjoyed unmatched food security thanks to an integrated agricultural system that seamlessly connected U.S. and Canadian production. That integration is now fracturing in real time, and the strategic implications are enormous. If this disruption persists beyond 18 months, structural changes in North American supply chains will become permanent. Farmers make multi-year decisions about land use, equipment, and crop selection. Once those decisions favor non-integrated markets like Asia, reversing them requires enormous investment and years of relationship building. To put this in historical perspective, think back to the U.S. Soviet grain embargo decades ago. American farmers were devastated because the Soviets simply found new suppliers. It took years for U.S. agriculture to rebuild those markets, and some relationships never recovered. Now, history is repeating itself, but this time, America is actively imposing restrictions on its own neighbors, while those neighbors pivot toward China. The human cost is just as real as the economic and strategic implications. Rural communities across the Midwest and Plains states are already feeling the pain. Grain processing plants that have existed for generations are forced to close or downsize, leaving employees without alternatives. Trucking companies, small and family-owned, face bankruptcy when cross-border volumes collapse. Even equipment manufacturers and fertilizer companies are seeing their stock values decline as investors anticipate reduced demand. Every stage of the agricultural supply chain from farm to fork is under unprecedented stress. Yet the political response in Washington has been weak. Congressional Republicans from agricultural states are quietly concerned, but few are willing to publicly challenge the administration. Democrats are pointing to incoherent trade strategy, but neither party has a clear plan to reverse the damage already underway. Essentially, no one is taking control, and the country is careening toward an economic crisis while politicians argue about blame. Let's summarize the three most critical points to understand the gravity of what just happened. First, Canada signed a comprehensive deal with China that could lock American buyers out of Canadian grain markets for years. This is not speculation, it is happening right now. Second, American consumers are already paying the price. Food inflation for grain-based products has surged 12%, translating into nearly $1,000 extra per family annually, and that number will only grow as supply chain disruptions deepen. Third, the breakdown of North American agricultural integration is a self-inflicted strategic disaster. The U.S. is surrendering control over one of the most productive and integrated agricultural regions in the world. These are consequences that will take a generation to reverse. The key takeaway is stark. When you weaponize food trade against your closest allies, don't be surprised when they find new customers, and when American families bear the cost at grocery stores. This isn't about abstract trade theory or whether tariffs are good in principle. It's about the real-world fallout of a specific policy, implemented without consultation, transition periods, or consideration for decades of supply chain relationships. Now, the reality is unfolding exactly as predictable. Canada found new partners, China secured a strategic foothold, American agriculture is being dismantled, and consumers are paying higher prices. This is the situation we face today. The question that remains is whether the U.S. can respond in time, or whether this disruption becomes permanent, reshaping not just North American agriculture, but the economic and strategic balance of the continent. So here's the reality in simple terms. Canada just secured a deal that fundamentally shifts the balance of power in North American agriculture, and it happened literally yesterday. While tariffs were intended to pressure Canada, they instead gave Carney the perfect justification to pivot toward China, locking in long-term contracts and investment that will be nearly impossible to reverse. American consumers are already paying the price, families facing higher grocery bills, and small businesses throughout the agricultural supply chain are struggling to survive. This is not abstract or distant. It's happening right now, in real time, across farms, processing plants, ports, and transportation networks. The strategic consequences are staggering. Canada now has alternative markets lined up, China has secured food security, and the United States has voluntarily surrendered control over one of its most productive and integrated agricultural regions. Think about the lessons from this story. When you weaponize food trade against allies, you create ripple effects that last for decades. Supply chains don't just bounce back overnight. Relationships with buyers take years to rebuild, and farmers make planting decisions months in advance that can lock in these changes permanently. The next time we hear about tariffs, trade wars, or political brinkmanship, remember that these policies don't just affect abstract economic indicators, they shape real communities, livelihoods, and strategic advantages for generations. Canadian agriculture now has a lifeline, while American agriculture is being forced into reactive, costly adjustments. European and South American producers are positioning to take advantage, meaning America's self-inflicted disruption is creating opportunities for competitors abroad. Ultimately, this is a cautionary tale about the costs of short-sighted trade policy. It illustrates how a single decision, 25% tariffs, can cascade into a multi-layered economic and strategic crisis. For policymakers, it's a lesson in unintended consequences. For families, it's a warning about higher prices. And for American agriculture, it's a wake-up call that decades of integrated systems can be upended almost overnight. Canada found a new partner, China found a long-term strategic advantage, and American agriculture is facing the repercussions. The question now is whether the U.S. can respond before these structural shifts become permanent. So, I want to hear from you. Do you think America's trade strategy is truly protecting its interests, or are we watching the country voluntarily surrender decades of strategic advantages? Are these disruptions reversible, or is North American agricultural integration permanently altered by politics and tariffs? Drop your thoughts in the comments. This is more than a trade story. It's a warning, a lesson in economic strategy, and a real-time look at how quickly decades of careful planning can unravel when political decisions collide with global markets.